welcome to the Crash Course Cryptozoology podcast, and a very special edition at that. It being Halloween, I figured that an edition of the podcast focused on a more paranormal-esque cryptozoological case may be fitting, and as such, I contacted Tobias Wayland, one of the leading researchers in the ongoing flying humanoid / mothman case. He's one of the most educated, well-spoken, and well-read cryptozoologists out there, and it's a real pleasure to have him on tonight.
My name is Tobias Wayland, and I am the head writer and editor for the Singular Fortean Society, and that is a project that my wife Emily and I started back in 2016. And so, for anybody not familiar with the word Fortean, that's the one that most people get stuck on, understandably, because it's a little esoteric. That word comes from the early 20th century collector of weird news stories, Charles Fort. And so what he would do is he would collect all of these weird news stories from all over the world, and he would write fairly prolifically, really, about them, and do these sort of like tongue-in-cheek speculations, but there was also a lot of good insight in there. And he really sort of had this disdain for not just the popular religious movements of his day, but also the mainstream science that he felt ignored this, or I should say, ignored these phenomena. Basically, he would call it damned data. That is to say, inconvenient data that had been damned by every prevailing paradigm because they just would rather ignore it than have to deal with it. And he would look at things very holistically and try to make connections between them. You know, he didn't really believe in the separation of different aspects of unusual phenomena like we see so often today, you know, where you've got people who like to separate themselves into these camps, you know, where some people are only interested in ghosts and some are only interested in UFOs or cryptids, or even in the cryptid community, people breaking it down even further because they're only interested in Bigfoot or something. He didn't believe in that, and neither do we. And we actually very famously said once, and I love this quote, "One measures a circle beginning anywhere." And that is to say that by studying any aspect of the paranormal or Fortean phenomena, I think we can understand something about all of it, because there is quite a lot of overlap. There is such a similarity between these phenomena that I think that you can get a lot of insight about one area, surprising insight, really, about one area by studying another. And so that's something that we've really incorporated into our investigations. So I guess to be a little more specific sort of about what we do, you know, obviously we do enjoy investigating the paranormal, so we'll do all of the things that people associate with that, be it witness interviews, on-site investigations, and so on and so forth. Research, of course, that's an integral part of any investigation. But beyond that, just sort of how we represent these investigations is in a more journalistic style. So, you know, we'll write feature articles, news articles, and the news articles are something where we try to maintain a sort of strict objectivity, very journalistic, really just trying to present the facts as we know them, even if those facts are only that we know somebody said something happened to them. And the reason for that specifically was when we started the Singular Fortean Society, we saw a real lack of journalistic coverage and integrity in how a lot of these subjects were presented, especially online. And we wanted to help fill that void, frankly. I mean, I think we both know there's a lot of misinformation that circulates quite often online, and being able to sort of do our part and help educate people and hopefully provide people with a place where they know they can go, where nothing's going to be embellished. We're not going to be disingenuous about anything, and try to present something of dubious origin off as something very interesting, or anything similar. So that's sort of been the approach that we take, and we do take a little bit of pride in that, because we think it's important.
Mm. You certainly seem like you're a bit of a student of Fort, so to speak. Um, you mentioned that Fort had this very holistic view of, we'll say, Fortean or anomalous phenomena in general. Why do you think it is imperative to have a holistic view of that kind of phenomenon? Or maybe a holistic approach is the right word.
Sure. So I think that its importance comes from its undeniability, frankly. You would have to ignore a good percentage of the reports that come in order to pretend as though there weren't heavy similarities. I'll give you an example. So I
Mm.
spoke to a young woman not too long ago, earlier this year, who wanted to relate a series of events that her family had gone through. That was here in Madison, Wisconsin. And so she wanted initially to get a hold of us to report a sighting that her mother had, and her mother wasn't quite comfortable coming forward herself. She let her daughter speak on her behalf,
Mm.
but she wanted to try to help her mother understand her experience, and so she contacted us and told us about a couple of sightings that her mother had with this winged humanoid with these glowing red eyes.
Mm.
And this was a very impactful experience on her mother, and her as well, because when she was a kid, she lived through her mother experiencing this, and she saw how it affected her, and the fear that her mother felt, which has got to be profound for a child to witness.
Mm.
And if I wouldn't have questioned anything else, if I would have just taken those two sightings, then maybe we could have said, oh well, I mean, it was just a flying humanoid. Maybe that means it's some sort of cryptid or biological being. Maybe it's Mothman. Who knows? But you can't stop there. So of course, I always ask, have you had any other paranormal experiences before or since? And after I asked that, it came out that prior to the uh, sightings of this winged humanoid, they had experienced what people would commonly recognize as a sort of haunting phenomena, like this paranormal phenomena in their apartment building.
Mm.
So they had heard what sounded like a baby crying, um, and of course they couldn't find the source of it, and they would hear what sounded like all of their cupboards being thrown open at night, and all the dishes coming out and crashing onto the floor, only to run out and discover that seemingly nothing had happened.
Mm.
And they said that this activity picked up when there was some work being done in the basement of their apartment building. And then shortly after that, the apartment building burnt down.
Oh, wow.
And after it burned down, and they had temporarily moved out and been put up in another apartment building, pending the rebuilding of the damaged one.
Mm.
That's when her mother had her first flying humanoid sighting. And the second one came after the apartment building had been rebuilt and they had moved back in, when her mother had went down into the basement to do laundry. And there was a storage space across from the washer. And her mother turned around, and in their storage space, she saw this creature again that she'd previously seen flying overhead. And of course, she was terrified and ran upstairs. And then after that, um, this young woman related how at the time, again, when she was a child, her aunt and uncle lived just above them. So there was an apartment unit above them, and her aunt and uncle lived up there. And she had gone up there one day to hang out. Her aunt was braiding her hair or something. And her aunt had to get ready to go somewhere. So she went to hop in the shower, and the girl went downstairs, and her uncle was in their bedroom. And while the aunt was in the shower, they had, you've probably seen these. It was one of those religious candles, so it's like a tall, thinner candle, probably had a picture of the Virgin Mary or something on it.
Yes, right.
And while she was in there, this candle lit itself on fire. And I don't mean that the wick started on fire. The entire candle started. And this was a candle that they generally didn't use because it was for decoration. And so it started itself on fire. And her uncle noticed and, came out and they put it out. But what a bizarre series of events to sandwich these winged humanoid sightings, and it's undeniable to me when you get reports like this that there must be some connection, because if you take any of the phenomena presented by like this particular witness and isolate it, then it's easy to put it into some kind of category. If it's just the baby crying, if it's just the dishes seeming to fly out of the cupboards, then you say, oh, that's a haunting. And if it's just this large black winged humanoid with these red eyes, you say, oh, that's Mothman. That's fine. I can put that in a little box. But when it's all happening together, then it becomes much more difficult. And I think that the temptation for people is to try to separate this stuff, but you just can't. I mean, it would be a disservice to this witness to try to separate all of this stuff that very clearly played out in a very specific timeline.
Do you think that phenomena like this is something that, when hopefully eventually we learn the truth behind it, could be sorted into a box that we just don't have a concept of yet? Or do you think that this is something that is maybe a bit too multifaceted for that?
I think that individual events that hold a striking similarity could have separate causes. So, for instance, let's use apparitions as an example. So, in one instance, you might have someone witness an apparition that appears to interact with them with some sort of intelligence before disappearing. And so, maybe that could represent, say, the surviving consciousness of a seemingly dead individual. Or maybe that could represent a brief interaction with someone from a parallel universe or something similar. And then you might have somebody who witnesses an apparition that seems to be completely oblivious to them and just going about its business, replaying the same event over and over again. And maybe that's some sort of metaphysical recording imprinted on the specific area, or somebody glimpsing this event out of time, repeating itself endlessly, or something similar. So, you could have these apparitions that both on the surface look like normal people, doing something. And if you just gave it that sort of surface level examination, then you might think that it's the same cause. But if you look at them individually and really dig in, then I think it's possible for them to have separate origins. So I guess in answer to your question, yeah, I do think that given a certain level of understanding of these phenomena, we very easily could find that seemingly similar phenomena actually have separate origins, and we could place them in different boxes.
So you would say that there's multiple boxes to be conceived of, not just one.
Yeah, I never really bought into the well, it's really gaining a lot of popularity. I think this idea probably goes back to at least the 60s and 70s, although, Charles Fort very famously would quip about the cosmic trickster even back in the
Mm,
early 20th century. But I don't know how seriously he really took that idea. I think it was just sort of a convenient metaphor for him.
mm,
But, there are people, John Keel, of course, comes to mind, who have this idea that there is a common source for all paranormal phenomena. And that idea has certainly regained a level of popularity today. And I struggle with it because I think it's very convenient, but I think it's also a very surface level examination of these phenomena for the reason that I just mentioned.
mm.
I think if you look at a lot of these cases individually, although they may appear similar, um, they really don't actually have that much in common when you gain a certain understanding.
Mm. Yeah, you've certainly made the case that seems to be the more, you could say, sensible approach to assume that there are different causes for different phenomena because there are these minute differences that kind of space them apart a bit too much.
Right. And I guess the one caveat I would add is um, I do allow for there to be similarities. So, for instance, let's say, um, you it's not as though there wouldn't be any similarities at all. Going back to that, the example of the apparitions,
Mm,
it's not as though there wouldn't be any similarities at all there. If you're talking about various phenomena that say all operate on the level of human consciousness, for instance,
mm,
like that would be a similarity, but the individual phenomena sort of within that field wouldn't necessarily have anything more in common than say the individual species that populate our planet. Like they certainly have biological similarities, but they are yet distinct species,
mm.
if that makes sense.
It does make sense, yeah. Now, of course, your focus tends to be on a wide range of high strangeness, so to speak. What are some of the most, what would you say, the most landmark cases that have sort of piqued your interest in the Fortean phenomena?
Well, I could go back to my own childhood, really, and certainly I had my own experiences growing up. But as far as I think some of the more well-known cases, there have been quite a few that piqued my curiosity. Even as a young child, like I was fascinated with the Kelly Hopkinsville
Mm,
encounter. The small, seemingly UFO occupant. Maybe not. Goblinoid creatures that assaulted that farmhouse. That was a very formative account for me
mm,
when I was a kid. Otherwise, the Dover Demon had always been a favorite, um, simply because it's it's difficult to say what those kids saw, and how much of it could have potentially been a prank by them. But I think that we have to, especially after this amount of time, like it's fine to speculate about stories like that, but I think that at a certain point, you really just have to take it or leave it as far as what the investigators at the time turned up. So if they said that the witnesses at that time seemed credible, I mean, you don't have to believe them, but you certainly can't disprove them.
mm.
So, for me, I choose to believe. Okay, if they said these kids seemed credible, they didn't seem like they were making it up. They seemed like upstanding kids. Then, yeah, uh, maybe they saw something. It certainly seems like they did. So that was always a really interesting one for me too. I guess anything that was weird, Flatwoods. I
Mm.
I always loved that case. Um, any really remarkable uh, unusual, seemingly like unique case of high strangeness. Like those have always been the stories that I've been most attracted to.
Mm. You mentioned the credibility of witnesses, and I think that's very interesting when you talk about 14 phenomenon because so much of it on the surface level is very hard to believe.
Oh, sure.
I read a bit of your newest book last year, I think it was, and I remember distinctly that a lot of what you talked about was I think it was called the experiential nature of a lot
Mm.
of this phenomenon. Can you explain what that means?
Sure. So most of the time, if I may speak in generalities here for a moment, most of the time, when it comes to paranormal phenomena, regardless of the particular aspect we're paying attention to, be it cryptids or UFOs or creatures or ghosts, whatever, what we have is the witness's experience, and that's all of the evidence that we have.
Mm.
Obviously, if we had more, that would be a much bigger deal. Uh, but generally, we don't. We have the experience of witnesses to go by, and that's really the only way currently we have to understand these phenomena.
Mm.
So you can either experience it yourself, or you can speak to someone else who has experienced it. But generally speaking, that's the only means we have currently of attempting to really understand these phenomena. And of course, there are exceptions. There is limited physical evidence for, say, Bigfoot, for instance.
Mm.
There are some very compelling video and photographic images and evidence for UFOs.
Mm.
But those are the exception by far. So usually what we are left with is people's experiences as they're being related to us, the investigators, and that honestly is why I think it's important for everybody to understand narrative, for instance, understand bias,
Mm.
be able to try to suss out the actual story from somebody's narrative, because very commonly when a witness is relating their experience to you, they're going to add their own narrative, which is totally normal. Like that's natural,
Mm.
and it will be sort of colored by their personal belief system. So you might have somebody see a winged humanoid, and call it an angel or a demon or anything else that happens to fall within their belief system. I mean, I can give you a good example from my personal life. I had grown up seeing uh, shadow people and experiencing all sorts of strange phenomena as a kid. And I remember speaking to my sister a while back. This would have been a few years ago, and she said that she saw what looked like a uh, shadow person in our family room.
Mm.
This is at our parents' house, and she immediately, and I didn't even get a chance to say anything about it. She immediately said, I really felt like it was Grandma coming in to check on me. And, I didn't have the heart to say anything, but there's literally no reason to believe that it was.
Mm.
That was the narrative she had applied to it. And you see that a lot with witnesses. So you really have to work to um, sort of, separate their particular narrative from their experience, which can be difficult, but that's
Mm.
also why it's important to confirm all of the details that you can otherwise, and really just try to report the facts, as it were,
Mm.
as best you can.
What do you think is the difficulty in separating the perception from the actual event? Because obviously, the event being so strange, the perception can be something on the same kind of strangeness playing field in a way, I suppose.
Sure. Well, I mean, the main difficulty, of course, lies in that when dealing with these experiential phenomena, again, all you really have for the most part is the testimony of the witness. And so, what's important there is knowing how to ask the right questions.
Mm.
You want questions that are asking for factual descriptions rather than subjective opinion. So I might ask somebody if they say they saw a strange humanoid or something. I'm not going to be like, "Do you think it was Bigfoot?" No, you have
Mm.
to ask them. How tall was it? What could you use to measure its height? The length of their sighting, just everything related to it that isn't their opinion. Um, and I think that the main difficulty there, of course, is separating opinion from fact as
Mm.
far as that goes. And so, like I said, really the best way to do that is to ask only questions that excise
Mm.
opinion from their testimony.
Right. Do you feel that there are any cases in which the opinion of the witness is to some extent important data? Perhaps there's trends in what people feel like they're observing in similar things, or does it tend to be a bit too varying for actual measurement?
I think that it's very important because I think that how and how and why people experience these things the way that they do isn't something that we should just ignore. I'm certainly not one of those people, who would be so arrogant, I guess, as to completely discard a witness's feelings or emotions or anything else. So um, I think that the way people experience these phenomena is important in what it can tell us about um, ourselves, frankly.
Mm.
And beyond that, there is a certain level of subjective experience that I think is very valuable in terms of understanding the phenomenon itself, like whatever they happen to be uh, witness to. So, for instance, I may ask someone if they had any strong feelings or emotions in response to their sighting, because something that I found, of course, is especially in the Lake Michigan Mothman cases, there was often a strong feeling of fear. Some people would describe feeling a palpable sense of evil. And so I understand how that seems very subjective, but I think that if you can sort of remove that experience from any sort of biased narrative. So, for instance, you need to acknowledge that they felt what they felt, and so you can track that trend if it's occurring, among multiple witnesses.
Mm.
And so, like with the fear, for instance, it's important to note that people were feeling that fear without necessarily ascribing a particular cause to it, because we don't really have any strong evidence to point towards why, but it's still certainly worth paying attention to the fact that it's happening.
Mm. Right, yeah, it definitely seems like, especially like you mentioned, with not just Lake Michigan, but a lot of Mothman-like cases, there is this massive trend in the data for a feeling of specifically dread. Um, what other trends in data do you find that you think could be significant to these cases?
Well, if I'm speaking specifically about the Lake Michigan Mothman, like there has been quite a few similarities between reports. Now, the general creature description, there is quite a bit of similarity from case to case. Although, of course, there has been some variation too, and you can't ignore that either. But most commonly, there have been similarities in geography, which is a big one for me. You look at a lot of these cases, and often they'll be, say, in or around a park or natural area. Very often, very close to water, and it's difficult to know what to do with that. Because I mean, in the Midwest, especially around the Great Lakes, these are wetland areas, and there are lots of parks, and there's lots of water. But I still think that it's worth mentioning because well, much like Charles Fort, you can't just throw out details. You have to sort of include everything that might be relevant because, frankly, at this point, we have no idea what's relevant and what isn't. So we have to include everything we can that could potentially mean anything, because we're still so far away from seeing the big picture on any of this stuff.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think this in many senses is at least resembling a budding field of science, and in that sense, it's in its absolute infancy. And what's kind of what would you say? What's kind of in a humorous way inverted about that is your study of the Lake Michigan Mothman case is kind of not very not I shouldn't say it's not entirely independent because it's kind of a part of this long chain of Mothman-like sightings that you especially have been bringing to attention a lot recently. What interested you in the Lake Michigan Mothman case?
Honestly, very early on, it's it's profundity, frankly. Going all the way back to 2017 and the spring of that year, when I saw the first reports that I was aware of come through, I was covering it journalistically, and so I saw that first trio of cases come through the MUFON, CMS database, and I thought, okay, well, I'll cover this. Like, this seems like a cool story that I think our readers would be interested in. And so, I mean, anybody who knows MUFON or has worked with MUFON knows that they're not really known for sharing information outside of the organization. So I sort of had the press release that they had done, and that was really it at that time. And so I was like, okay, well, this is interesting. So I'll write it up. I can write an article on it. Put it out there. I think people will like it. And I really thought that was going to be it. But that's not what happened. Obviously, next thing you know, I'm seeing all of these reports coming through. Phantoms and Monsters and UFO Clearinghouse. And so I had to do my due diligence, and I reached out to those guys specifically. Lon Strickler and Manuel Navarrete, respectively. And I interviewed them both, very early on. I think June and July were the two interviews with them. And they were very forthright and forthcoming as far as what, they could speculate about at that time. Because, if you think we have no answers now, we had even fewer, answers back then. And so after interviewing them, and being able to speak with them, I knew there was something to this. It wasn't just an internet fad. It wasn't a creepypasta. Like, this wasn't it wasn't a hoax. It wasn't made up. And it wasn't too long after that that due to my proximity to these sightings, they and our platform at the Singular Fortean Society, they asked Emily and I to join the investigation, and we started getting sighting reports ourselves through the Singular Fortean Society. Still do, of course. And once that started happening, and because it's one thing to meet an investigator and find them honest, credible in that sense, and say, okay, well, like, they said that they talked to this person. and I'm going to choose to believe them because they seem like a good person. It's a whole other story when you're getting these witnesses contacting you, and then you're speaking with them, and and that makes it very real, frankly, as far as the idea that there's definitely something going on.
Mm.
And so at that point, I mean, there's really no going back. Um, a big part of the reason that I personally got into this is because I understand how isolating and impactful these experiences are, and what most people who have them end up having to live with. Well, let me give you an example. One of the most common narratives among witnesses is that they will have a sighting experience, be it Bigfoot or UFO or a Mothman, whatever. And it's a powerful experience. It challenges everything that we think we know.
Mm.
And they want to tell somebody. They want to confide in someone. And so they'll go to a loved one. Could be a parent, a sibling, a spouse, a close friend, somebody that they trust implicitly. And they'll tell them. And the most common response they get is to be laughed at.
Hmm.
And that's traumatic, frankly. And
Mm.
once that happens, a lot of times they never talk about it again. If they do, it's usually because they found someone like me who will take them seriously, who's not going to laugh at them, who understands the difficulty of living with that experience, which honestly is a big reason why whenever I can. I would never coerce anyone, and I would never make anybody do anything that they're not comfortable doing.
Mm.
I'll just say that right away. But, God bless anybody who is willing to go on the record about their sighting experience. And at this point, there have been a decent amount of people, that I've spoken to personally who have been willing to go on the record, put their name out there, say, look, I know this is the internet, but, like, these investigators aren't making it up. This is my story. I stand by it. It's not all just anonymous people
Mm.
on the internet. And I think that just does so much to uh, erode the stigma attached to this stuff.
Mm. As somebody who is doing their best to make people who have allegedly had these experiences more comfortable with talking about them, do you think that these experiences are more common than we tend to perceive them as?
I would say so. One thing I like to joke actually is everybody is only about 3 beers away from sharing their paranormal story
Mm.
because, frankly, that's something that I've experienced for certainly my entire adult life. Is I'll meet, say, like Emily's friends from work or just whomever, frankly, and they learn about what we do. They learn about me being an investigator, researcher, 40 and whatever. And next thing you know, like, say we're out having a cocktail or just in a quiet moment or something, and they're like, well, hey, let me tell you about the time I saw this crazy thing, or this haunted house that I grew up in, or
Mm.
something similar. It's been near universal, frankly, that everybody that I've met has had some kind of questionable experience, something that challenged the prevailing paradigm of scientific materialism at least once in their life.
Mm. What kinds of experiences do you feel tend to be the most common so far?
In my experience, and I don't have any statistical data or anything to back this up, but in my experience, I would say the most popular are ghosts and hauntings and UFOs,
Mm.
with probably Bigfoot a close third there. And I personally, again, like, completely anecdotally, I personally ascribe that to the influence had by things like reality television and the I won't say complete because I think we're far from that, but the relative acceptance with which those subjects are treated in the mainstream because of the popularity of some of those reality television shows.
Mm. Right. Yeah, there certainly is this kind of shifting perception on the way in which that subject is treated. Do you think that the stigma that currently exists for that phenomenon is different than it was, say, 3 decades ago?
I would say that, honestly.
Mm.
I really would. Now, it's difficult for me, I guess, to try to relate the experience of 3 decades ago because, I would have been a really little kid.
Mm.
So I guess I don't know what people were going through um, objectively, like I wasn't there. But, from researching old newspaper accounts and old eyewitness accounts and things. Um, what I saw emerge out of the 50s, 60s, and 70s was a lot of witnesses relating their experiences, often to mainstream news sources, and basically having their lives ruined,
Mm.
frankly, where they would be hounded and mocked in their own communities. Like Joe Simonton comes to mind. He was a respected member in his community up in Eagle River, Wisconsin, prior to the, uh, uh, flying saucer flapjacks incident of 1961. Um, and I think that you don't see that anymore for the most part, because there are lots of people, even on like mainstream news sources, you'll see like CNN covering uh, somebody's haunted house or like somebody capturing a ghost on their nanny cam or something. And yeah, I mean, maybe they do it a little tongue in cheek, but I think it's gained enough acceptance where when people do that, their lives aren't being ruined anymore.
Mm.
Maybe somebody will make a snide comment out of the side of their mouth or something, but that's really it. You don't see um, the Joe Simontons of the world out there having their lives turned upside down, wishing they'd never said anything anymore.
Mm. Do you think that that change in the paradigm of how people see this kind of thing is why perhaps we're seeing cases pop up that are similar in some ways to very old ones? Like, for instance, the Chicago or Lake Michigan Mothman sightings. Obviously, most of us would recognize the word Mothman from the Point Pleasant sightings, when in fact there's a history behind that and continuing forward from it that is almost identical in nature.
Yeah, I do actually. Something that a lot of witnesses, say to me, and obviously, like you and I know Mothman, but most normal people have never heard of Mothman. They
Mm.
have no idea what Mothman is. But a lot of people will see something that I've written, or I literally 2 days ago, I spoke to a witness who, he had the I don't want to say normal, but I guess relatively common experience of, seeing a large black flying humanoid with these glowing red eyes, and he ended up telling his dad and getting laughed at, and never spoke about it again. This was years ago. His
Mm.
experience was in 2016, but he happened to be watching Amazon Prime with his sister, and they were looking for something unusual to watch, and they stumbled upon Small Town Monsters: Terror in the Skies. And
Oh,
so,
wow.
yeah, he saw me in there, and he was like, "Well, that's the guy. That's the guy I have to talk to about his experience."
Mm.
Reached out to me through my author page on Facebook, and yeah, I mean, he's willing to go on the record. But he didn't have, or he felt like he didn't have anybody that he could speak with about his experience until he watched that documentary and saw that there was at least one person out there who was taking this seriously. Not like I'm the only one who is, but I represented that in that particular documentary. So I do think that the prevalence for this stuff in media is encouraging people to come forward who might not have otherwise. I mean, the oldest historical sighting that I've taken at this time, speaking strictly about the Lake Michigan Mothman investigation, was from 1957. Gerald Therese, actually, a really nice guy, older guy. He's 79 now, but he had a sighting when he was out hunting in Illinois of this weird winged flying humanoid, and he held on to that for decades. Never told anybody about it. Didn't even know that anybody had experienced anything similar until he saw somebody share an article that I had written. And so, yeah, I mean, it's having a very positive influence on people's willingness to come forward. Definitely, I think it's been overall very positive.
It's definitely good to see that because obviously there's not just a concern for the the fullness, you could say, of the data that we're trying to uh, interpret here, but also for the well-being of people who might think that they're crazy, quite frankly. And doesn't say that they're not crazy necessarily, but at least they're not driving themselves insane over it. Um, Going back to the Lake Michigan not Mothman thing, what is? Can you tell us about that case?
Sure. I mean, I guess it's a huge investigation with
Mm.
with over 100 different sighting reports. But if I had to, if I wanted to give somebody sort of a brief overview of it, I would point out, and I always have to start with this because it's the least fun part, but it's absolutely necessary.
Mm.
There are about half of those cases that I think are misidentified birds.
Mm.
And there's some good, well, I've got some really good circumstantial evidence to point towards that. So if you look at the effect that climate change has had on the migratory patterns of large birds, so think like cranes and herons.
Mm.
Now, they are coming north sooner and staying north longer than they have ever before. And they'll even overwinter here now. It's not super common, but it does happen.
Oh wow.
Really, they'll overwinter anywhere in small numbers that has open water. So as long as the water hasn't frozen over.
Mm.
And so that combined with the destruction of wetland habitats has led to a record number of herons and cranes roosting in otherwise populated urban areas. So you can look at like Lincoln Park in Chicago, for instance, and the number of black-crowned night herons roosting in this park in like the middle of the city exploded over like the past 10 years, from like double digits into like triple digits,
Mm.
And so that's a huge increase. And so there are people who they're not making up their sighting. They definitely saw something that was unusual. But these are people who can legitimately say, hey, I've lived here my whole life and I've never seen anything like this before, and have it still be a bird and be telling the truth. You know
Mm.
what I mean? Yeah,
Right.
maybe they've never seen a great blue heron, flying before, because while they do travel through this area, um, maybe you just hadn't seen one, but now they're here in record numbers, and you've got all these different herons who are here in record numbers, and you're seeing them more often. And so you'll get a lot of these sighting reports that will describe something, especially the daytime sighting
Mm.
report, where people will describe something that seems remarkably bird-like that they just didn't recognize, didn't get a really great look at it. It was backlit by the sun. It was certainly, very large, which is understandable because, a great blue heron or even a sandhill crane, they have like a 7-foot wingspan.
Mm.
They're flying dinosaurs, and it surprises them, and and I think it's perfectly understandable that they would think that it's something strange. But you look at, say, the Pilsen case from May of 2018, which is an excellent piece of video evidence that we got to support this particular profile. And there we have a guy who was bicycling to work through the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago, and he happened to see a couple on the street corner looking at something in the sky, and he looked up himself, and he saw what he initially described as either a giant bat or a man in a wingsuit.
Mm.
He had a GoPro camera, quite luckily, on his bicycle helmet, and decided he was going to follow this thing around and try to get as much footage of it as possible.
Mm.
And he did a great job. He got a ton of good footage of this thing, and he was very forthcoming as a witness. He was a great witness. I talked to him on the phone. He sent me the footage. He even, offered to send me the SD card that the footage was on.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I guess long story short, we were able to isolate some really good still images of this thing, blow them up a little bit. And it's a bird. It's absolutely a bird. From its profile, I would guess gray blue heron. Because there's a particular sort of tilt to its wings that was, and the fact that its head looks sort of retracted, because when herons fly, they have these long necks, but when they fly, they kind of pull their head back so you can't see their neck, as opposed to cranes that usually fly with their neck extended.
Right.
But dude, it's a heron. It totally is some kind of bird, but heron is my guess. But that really helped. It was. I almost feel bad for this guy because, at that point, he was almost like apologetic, and I was like, look, man, this is great. You have no idea how great this is, because I've suspected this for a really long time, and now finally, I have this profile for specific cases that I can apply to certain witnesses' testimony and go, okay, they probably have seen a bird. They misidentified some kind of bird, and being able to do that has really allowed me to focus on the much weirder cases. Because now about half of them likely being misidentified birds means that the other half aren't, and those half are so weird and just so out there and so fascinating that you could spend a lifetime exploring them, frankly, and probably still never come away with any real definitive answer, barring some sort of large breakthrough, which you never know. But honestly, I think that's the investigation to this point. If obviously there are a lot of very specific cases that are very, very interesting to me, but a brief overview, is so far to date, I feel pretty good about being able to rule out about half of the sightings as being misidentified large birds. And those sightings usually take place during the day. They lack any of the paranormal elements that are more often described in the nighttime sightings. And there's a lot of circumstantial and even hard evidence that points towards that particular profile of sightings being of misidentified large birds. And then the other half are just, crazy paranormal mothman.
What are some specific features of that other half that seem to set it apart from a possible misidentification?
Sure. So, like I mentioned earlier, with that witness in Madison here, you'll often have these seemingly like peripheral paranormal phenomena. Could be something that could be mistaken for a haunting, or maybe it is a haunting. I have no idea. Could be a UFO sighting, for instance. You'll also have often people describing this very stark fear You'll have them sometimes describing feeling like a palpable sense of evil. You'll have people talking about um, these physical attributes that are seemingly paranormal, like glowing red eyes. Um, and you'll have people who are capable of giving descriptions that are lacking in the misidentified, bird uh, reports. So, often in the weirder reports, people might be a little closer, might get a better look at it. Um, they might see it on the ground and then watch it take off. So they'll actually be able to very clearly see like a humanoid shape. Um, it's really those elements. There are enough um, seemingly paranormal elements, I think, when you look at them, that they really are set apart for whatever that means. They're clearly quite different to me.
Mm. Do you think that when there is data that is more out there, like some of the paranormal data tends to be, that there's something convincing about that?
I wouldn't say so.
Mm.
I find, again, going back to that element of these phenomena as being experiential. I think that rather than the seeming phenomenon itself being convincing, you have to find the witness convincing. So if I'm able to speak to someone directly and they relate their testimony to me, and I am able to corroborate the details of their testimony, to show that the story, at least the parts that I can corroborate, are accurate, and they seem credible, and certainly they have nothing to gain. And when you speak to somebody, often you can hear the fear in their voice, and
Mm.
and so if all of that is credible, that to me lends the paranormal elements credibility. It's not the paranormal elements themselves that seem more believable, because of course it's usually quite the opposite.
Mm. Yeah, I would absolutely think that that's probably the most accurate way of looking at that because, especially with the paranormal being something that is very by its own nature, not readily explainable. Have you yourself had any kind of experience with this phenomenon during the time that you've been researching the Mothman sightings in Michigan?
Now, I have not seen anything I would describe as a flying humanoid.
Mm.
Certainly not. I will say that since the advent of this investigation, I have experienced a number of strange phenomena. Probably most prolifically would be seeing weird shadow people.
Mm.
Often when I'm outside. Now, I can give you an example of that. I was walking my dog one night, and I was at the bottom of our hill. We kind of live halfway up a hill on this little street, and I turned around and I saw standing up by this park, sort of across another street at the top of this hill, and it looked like these hooded shadow figures. And in that moment, in seeing them, I felt distinctly like I was being watched. And,
Hmm.
I looked at them for a good 3 seconds. And as I'm looking at them, like they vanished, it just
Hmm.
disappeared.
Hmm.
Um, and I had seen something similar prior to that. Again, I was out walking the dog. I don't know what it is about, being out walking the dog. But I was out walking the dog, and we were about to cross the street to come home. And again, this is nighttime. And I see across the street our neighbor sitting on his front porch. It was dark out, and the porch light wasn't on, so I didn't get a lot of detail. But I definitely saw him sitting there, and it looked like he had his hoodie pulled up over his head. And I was like, that's a little unusual, but whatever. And as I'm crossing the street, I glance at him again because I'm the kind of person where, like, if I walk eye somebody too closely, like I gotta at least wave or something.
Mm.
So I'm getting ready to do that, and I look over at him again, and I'm like, I'm about to wave as we're coming across the street, and he just disappears. And I was like, well, that clearly wasn't my neighbor. I had looked over and seen a shadowy figure again with this hood sitting on the steps, and assumed it was my neighbor because that made the most logical sense at the time.
Mm.
But unless he had since learned to teleport, it couldn't possibly have been him. Um, and so, I mean, those are two examples certainly of the increased high strangeness activity that I had personally been privy to since this investigation started.
Mm. Since you've started this investigation, or rather started your involvement in this investigation, aside from the stranger experiences you've had outside of it, but that seem to somewhat coincide with the time frame, does your investigation, I should say, entail going to locations? Are you mainly journalistic?
We definitely do go to locations
Mm.
whenever possible, um, and we have gone to quite a few at this point. I do think that there is some value in that. I think the most valuable aspect of investigation, in this sense, because these aren't recurring phenomena. It's not like a haunting where you say this house is haunted, so you have to go to that house to check it out, right?
Mm.
Um, it's very, very unusual for somebody to report this creature, whatever it is, this phenomenon, we'll say, in the exact same place twice.
Mm.
So, we're happy to go speak to witnesses on site and have them show us the location of their sighting and sort of point out where everything happened. And I think that that's great. I think there is value in that. And we're certainly willing to do it whenever. Uh, but I think the most important thing really is being able to speak with them
Mm.
and then of course verify everything that you possibly can. And of course, a great way to be able to verify witness details is by going to the actual site. So there certainly is value in that, and it's something that we have definitely taken the time to do.
Mm. It certainly seems like your approach to boots on the ground work, so to speak, is to verify certain qualities of the area that are alleged in a sighting. There are other perspectives in the field that are a bit more, I guess you could say, expedition oriented. Do you feel that perhaps the approach that is meant to verify surroundings instead of be more of a search for creature X, sighting X, do you think there's a value disparity between those to some degree?
I don't think I would necessarily.
Mm.
I think that we need both approaches, frankly, because I don't think that anybody could say with any confidence that one is better than the other, because frankly, we don't know at
Mm.
this point. So I think we need both. And to that end, I would be happy to do more of the expeditionary sort of research in that regard rather than the corroborative sort of detail investigation that I've been doing. But since we know so little about these phenomena, I would have to say, as I think it would be the most honest answer at this point. For all we know, they are both equally valuable.
Mm. Right. Have you had more experience, would you say, with the qualitative trip than the expedition trip, or do you try to dabble in both?
We definitely dabble in both.
Mm.
We've been doing a lot of investigation out in the southern unit of the Kettle Moraine State Forest with Jay Bachochin lately. And that's something we've always been interested in doing. It hasn't gotten as much coverage, but certainly when we started out, we did a lot of going to haunted houses, doing that kind of um, experiential investigation, frankly, where you're going to a place to experience whatever phenomena might be present.
Mm.
And in doing so, I think that we got a lot of value out of that, because we did experience some weird stuff. At some of the reputedly haunted houses we've been at, we've experienced a lot of strange stuff with Jay out in that forest.
Mm.
Um, and so, yeah, I guess I hadn't really thought about it before because I had never really sat down and given one approach, any sort of strict value over the other. I do think that I very much enjoy both, and I think that, really, now that I'm thinking about it, sort of what we had been doing, without thinking about it, frankly, was taking whichever approach we thought most appropriate at that time. So, when it comes to, going out and exploring the kettle with Jay, of course, that's an expeditionary event, in experiential investigation where you're going there because you want to try to capture something, experience that thing. Um, and when it came to Lake Michigan Mothman stuff, the chances of us, experiencing, this Mothman phenomenon were so small because the event never really repeated itself in the exact same area. So the correct approach at that time for that specific investigation seemed like, that qualitative approach that you spoke of.
Mm. Aside from the implications as to what approach might be best to investigate an area, what else do you think sightings, especially in terms of their, let's say, their locational consistency or lack thereof, what do you think that might say about a particular phenomenon or a particular set of sightings?
Well, I mean, I think that's a great question. As far as what it might say, I think that, well, using the Lake Michigan Mothman as a specific example, I don't strongly believe at this point that, assuming that something really unusual is going on and there's some sort of, element to this outside of human understanding. I don't believe that it's necessarily biological. And part of the reason for that would be the locational inconsistency.
Mm.
You would expect, if it was a biological animal, outside of something we've discovered at this point, but still biological, that it would be, roosting or living in these specific areas, and so you would see it in exactly the same place
Mm.
quite often, or at least something similar. And because we haven't been seeing that, combined with another, like any number of seemingly biological impossibilities that, correlate to these sightings. Um, I think that yeah, it's really sort of pushed me away from considering the idea of, any sort of undiscovered biological species being responsible for those sightings.
Mm. When we talk about the paranormal, I think that there's something of a uncertainty, or an uncertainty, I should say, about sometimes what someone means when they say paranormal. Do you think that you're someone who believes that the paranormal is just, so to speak, science that we don't understand yet, or do you think that it travels in its description beyond what we might consider a physical, biological, or explainable scope?
Well, um, I think people misuse the term science and paranormal,
Mm.
uh, far too often. I mean, nothing should be outside the realm of scientific understanding. Because at the end of the day, science isn't it's not a belief system. It's a system of investigation. It's a way of understanding our surroundings. And so, um, something could be paranormal, that is to say, outside of our current understanding. But that isn't to say that it would be impossible to be understood scientifically. Perhaps, like, we just don't have the means to do that yet, and I don't think that science has to be relegated to just the physical.
Mm.
I think that, A lot of people equate science to materialism, but I don't think that that's necessary. I think that is, I think it's reductive. Honestly,
Mm.
I think it's far too restrictive of an approach to science because, frankly, science and its approach to understanding should be able to be applied to anything.
Mm. That's a very interesting perspective. There definitely is something to be said for the nature of science, especially in the sense that it's something that shouldn't be a belief system. And I think you mentioned earlier that you feel that a lot of not just the cryptozoological field, but also the 14 field in general falls a bit too much into that category. Do you think that the misconstrued perception of what counts as scientific is part of that?
Yeah, I think that that could play a role in it, frankly. You often see people falling over themselves trying to fit whatever their particular area of interest in, or whatever their particular area of interest is, into our current understanding of the world, like our current scientific understanding of the world. And I think that that's the wrong way to go about this stuff, frankly. I think if it fit into our current scientific understanding of the world, we'd already understand it. Um, and so I think people do themselves a disservice, frankly,
Mm.
by trying to take the paranormal and fit it into um, the world we already understand, because I think it very likely represents a vast vista of reality that we have no understanding of, and so I think the true purest scientific under beginning to understanding that would be um, approaching it not as we would things we currently understand, but trying to come up with ways to unveil things that we don't currently understand.
Mm. It's a really interesting point to make. Jumping back again to the Lake Michigan Mothman and talking about the things that we need to attempt to kind of re-quantify into a broader sense of science, especially in terms of the accounts that you've come across, not just in the Lake Michigan Mothman case, but perhaps in other winged humanoid cases. What are some really standout cases to you?
Hmm. Well, certainly the one I mentioned earlier with
Mm.
the haunting phenomenon, um, or haunting phenomena rather. There were multiple instances of separate, seemingly parapsychological or paranormal phenomena attached to that case. That was a very interesting one to me. There were a couple of others. Uh, there was one in. These are both Lake Michigan Mothman investigations, although there have certainly been other investigations that were equally impactful. But there was a sighting near Mugwanago, Wisconsin, which is about 45 minutes outside of Milwaukee. And this was an interesting one. Emily and I went out there and were able to speak with this witness directly. And he related his story of having come home one night, relatively late at night. And he was speaking on his phone with his friend. And at the time, he was living with his parents. And so anybody who isn't familiar with Mugwanago, Wisconsin, by the way, it's a very rural area.
Mm.
There's a lot of natural areas and things out there. And so he had just come home and pulled into their long gravel driveway, which terminated in sort of a pseudo parking lot, and turned around and backed his van in like he always did. He didn't want to go inside because he was talking on his phone with his friend. And, if he went inside still talking on the phone, he might wake his parents up, and so he wanted to finish his conversation. And it had been misting out that day, but visibility was still pretty good. And the only light present was this lamppost they had at the end of their driveway, which is about 50 feet to the left in front of his van. And so, as he's speaking to his friend, he becomes aware of this huge figure standing directly in front of his van, and he decides he wants to take a better look at it, so he turns his headlights on. Seems like a sensible move, and he said he saw in his headlights, maybe 10 feet in front of the end of his hood there, this thing that he described as an 8 or 9 foot tall, scaly skinned, large black-eyed, bat-winged humanoid. And he said that it was standing there with its wings wrapped around itself, reminiscent of how a bat will wrap its wings around itself when hanging upside down.
Mm.
And he looked at it, and presumably it looked at him. And, he went silent for a second and then started telling his friend about what he was seeing. And as he was doing this, he said the thing blurred or shifted slightly and then was gone. And, he wasn't sure what that meant, whether it meant it shot up into the air or literally, just disappeared, teleported. I don't know, whatever. But it had a big effect on him. And so Emily and I went out there to speak with him, and he showed us where everything happened, and we were able to sort of, do what we do in these types of investigation as far as corroborating all of the details, certainly all of the weather, like all of the weather data and relevant distances and everything that all matched his story perfectly. And much more subjectively, I guess, speaking with this guy, I mean, it was maybe 10 a.m. on a Saturday, a nice spring day, very pleasant outside. And this guy was terrified. I mean, he was scared to death to be talking about this in broad daylight, and that stuck with me, I mean, he was sweating, like just terrified to still be talking about it, because it had that kind of effect on him. Like, that was how impactful this experience had been. And it's the kind of thing, where it's one thing to, for me to describe it to you, but when you actually see it, it's something else. It stays with you. So that was one that was very meaningful to me. Beyond that, there was another one, really a series in Woodstock, Illinois. Like, these matched up pretty well, actually, which is why I always like to mention them whenever possible. So Woodstock, Illinois, early 2019. A guy he's running a perfectly innocuous errand, like everybody in America does every day. He had to go to Walgreens to pick something up, and he's headed home. And I think it's about 8 p.m., but it's February, so it's dark out by then. And as he's driving towards his house, he's passing this natural area. It's the Dewfield Pond Conservation Area. And there's a little gravel, it's like pull-in that you could, pull into this natural area. But it's gated off right at that time, because it's closed during certain months of the year. And as he's coming up on it, in his headlights, he sees something step out of the road that he described as a tall, maybe 8 foot tall, hairy humanoid with these large, leathery gargoyle wings. And he says this thing stepped out in the road. He sees it in his headlights for a few seconds as it crosses the road, and then loses track of it as it goes between this house and a tree line across the street and into the McHenry County Fairgrounds. And this was another one where I talked to the guy over the phone and was able to arrange for Emily and I to go out there and talk to him. And I met him. I met his wife. They showed us around the sighting area. And again, there's literally no reason for these people to have made this story up. This is another thing that doesn't come up that often, but is worth mentioning. Like, socioeconomically, these witnesses run the gamut. You've got people from the working class on up through people with professional careers. And these particular people happen to be on the professional end of that spectrum, where I'm not going to say that they had, necessarily more to lose than somebody else, but I think from a certain perspective, especially in this country, people would look at them and say they had a lot to lose if this story came out. And yet there they were, inviting Emily and us to their home and then out to the sighting area to show us around. And, obviously they wanted to remain anonymous throughout. And I understand in their case why. But again, that was another one that sticks with you. I mean, Carrick, these people have no reason to lie. None. It doesn't make sense. They don't get anything out of it. And in fact, especially in that particular case, I think a lot of people would have said that they had a lot to lose, frankly, by being willing to share this story. But that man, that witness, he was sure in his belief when it came to having seen something anomalous. And because of that, he felt like he needed to share it. He felt like he needed to add to the canonical reports in this investigation. And then, there were some other interesting reports that came out of that area. Most notably probably would be shortly after that initial sighting, there was a guy who had contacted us to say that he had seen something similar when he was in there's a drugstore on the corner, nearby the sighting. It was like a Jewel Ostco or something. And he said that he was in the parking lot of that, and there's a fence along the parking lot, and then across the fence is the McHenry County Fairgrounds, which is where, in the initial sighting, that was the direction in which the entity or whatever was headed. And so this guy had said that he had seen something similar when he was outside in this parking lot, and that it had charged the fence, and as a result, he called 911. And in this particular instance, I was like, okay, would you be willing to be interviewed? And he never responded to my email or anything. So I was like, okay, well, this is one of those. But, I wanted to do my due diligence. And when somebody tells me they call 911, you better believe I'm going to submit a FOIA request every single time. And I did. And the McHenry County Sheriff's Department, I got to tell you, they are a delight, because they got back to me with the incident detail report of that 911 call in 2 or 3 days.
Oh,
the
wow.
turnaround was fantastic. Yeah. And so even though I was never able to speak directly to that witness, I had this physical proof that regardless of what he had experienced, he had definitely called 911. A sheriff's deputy definitely responded. There was no monster when the deputy showed up. But still, this guy was concerned enough to have called 911, and that was a big deal for me, in that really that represented the first time in that investigation where we had something that we could point to show some level of credibility insofar as somebody had actually contacted the authorities. That's something I can point to and be like, well, look, the McHenry County Sheriff's Department didn't forge this incident detail report. It's a thing, it exists.
Right.
So yeah, those two I think had a big impact on me. Although, and the earlier one with the haunting phenomena as well. But honestly, there have been so many, quite a few at this point that have been really excellent cases. And I think one of the really unfortunate parts of this investigation is that the really good cases sometimes get kind of lost in the noise. And people don't always know about them. They don't always see them. But they're definitely out there. And again, we've got people who've gone on the record, uh, lots of good cases where we're able to verify at least all of the details that are verifiable and things like that. So it's been a very interesting couple of years.
Yeah, I can imagine. Those are seriously enthralling stories, and especially with the sheriff's department story. I mean, it's incredible just knowing that this person was taking whatever happened seriously enough to actually call law enforcement about it.
Right.
Are there any recent cases that stand out to any degree that much?
Hmm. You know, there's been a lot of stuff reported recently around O'Hare, and some of those are pretty interesting. Although I haven't had as much interaction with those witnesses specifically. I will say, among those witnesses, there was a guy that I did speak to. He reached out to me directly. He works in one of the cargo areas out in the O'Hare International Airport down in Chicago,
Mm.
and he was driving out to meet one of his friends for a drink after work, and there's this big grassy area. Well, there's lots of big grassy areas around O'Hare, actually. Like people, I think, often conceive of it as this airport in the middle of a city, but really it's an airport outside of a city, surrounded by a lot of like natural areas and suburbs and stuff.
Mm.
Um, and he was headed out to meet one of his friends, and he turned towards this large grassy area behind this tall barbed wire fence, because of course security around the airport's pretty tight. And he said that he had seen this, 7 or 8 foot tall, uh, black winged creature with these glowing red eyes, and that when he saw it, he was terrified, and he said he felt this sense of evil from it. And when he said that, it reminded me of how many times I had heard that before, and how often it seems to pop up, regardless of where the latest flap is. Like
Mm.
regardless of whatever the current epicenter seems to be for this phenomenon, there's this consistency among the reports, with the sort of paranormal elements that we describe, like the glowing red eyes, for instance,
Mm.
where you hear people talk about this feeling this fear, or again, often people have literally used the word evil in conversation with me when relating their testimony, and that was fairly recently. I believe that was December of last year. Since then, check my timeline here, but I think that was chronologically the most recent report that I investigated directly. Certainly, there have been some received by Manuel through UFO Clearinghouse,
Mm.
and I can't speak to those, having not been the person involved. Of course, I reported on them, and I do what I always do, which is report um, exactly what is claimed to have been received from the witness, and then sort of what he said that he put into his investigation and everything, and just try to lay that out sort of objectively for everybody.
Mm.
Um, but I think that was the most recent, chronologically speaking, of course, again, when you're looking at the timeline, report that I had personally investigated. Now, certainly I've received reports since then, but they've all been, going back several years usually,
Mm.
at least. So,
Are there any? And I ask this because, especially flying humanoid sightings, tend to, seemingly at least, kind of have these flaps and then pop up elsewhere a little while later. Are there any reports recently that are coming from different locations across the country?
now, I have spoken, like throughout this investigation, I have received reports from other parts of the country.
Mm.
I've received reports from Ontario, Maryland, and California, just
Mm.
off the top of my head, from people who had reported winged humanoids.
Mm.
Now, those didn't represent flaps in their areas. These were really largely one-off sightings.
Mm. What do you think of the sort of dichotomy that exists between the fact that there's these flaps of reports and the fact that there's these one-off reports as well?
That's a really good question. I think that this is probably something. Well, I guess I will say this. I don't want to make a definite determination because I don't have all of the necessary information to do so. But
Mm.
I guess I would suspect that when it comes to the flaps in specific geographic areas, I don't know how much of that comes from people becoming aware of similar sightings in their area and then choosing to report them.
Mm.
So I guess that is to say that I believe in the possibility of the sightings being much more widespread than is reported, but they seem to appear within relatively tight geographic areas because that is who's reporting them at that time based on people's awareness of the sightings in their area.
Mm. That's interesting thing to note, I would say, because a lot of the perception of especially Mothman type winged humanoid sightings is that they are mainly a Midwest phenomenon. Do you think that that's the case, or does it seem more widespread than that?
Yeah, I don't think that's the case at all.
Mm.
I think that we've received reports from all over the place, and again, like it's the same story with those witnesses where they really had no idea that anybody else was reporting this stuff. They didn't have any idea that there was a place that they could report this stuff.
Mm.
And so what happens? I mean, certainly in the internet age, if you're using a search engine or something, you're much more likely to see a return on specific keywords if there is information pertaining to them that's in your area. So if you live around Lake Michigan and you're looking for weird stuff like this, you're much more likely to find, like, say, our specific investigation. Whereas if you live in a completely different area, you might come up with something completely different and not know that it's happening somewhere else and that there are places to report it. So it very likely could just go unreported.
Mm. Do you think that in that way, flaps might, instead of being these places that have these sightings occur very regularly, are places where people just happen to be reporting it more often?
I think that's entirely possible. Again, I'm not going to say that that is for sure what's happening, but I think it's definitely something that we have to consider and,
Mm.
and that we should keep in mind when investigating these so that we're not, disregarding whole areas that could have their own plethora of sightings.
Mm. In the same sort of line of thinking with locations, a lot of winged humanoid reports tend to be very, or at least as they're reported in popular media, don't take place in like big cities or around very large societal complexes. Is that true, or is it more the case that these are things that don't seem to be affected by, or at least the chance of them being reported is not affected by geological location?
Yeah, it certainly seems that way. I think when the sample size was just, the things people had reported around Point Pleasant, then, if you're working just off of that data, then yeah, sure, you'd probably say that, well, they seem to love small towns and rural areas for some reason. But then, with the information that we've gleaned since then from eyewitness testimony, I think it seems more likely that um, if the location is important on some level, it isn't important based on relative population density. since we do have these reports coming from relatively dense urban areas.
I must say you're an absolute like I don't think I've ever listened to somebody who has tried their best to understand the data they're collecting so well. What do you end up doing when you, or maybe what's a better word? When you analyze a set of factors in a situation and turn that into data in that sense, what happens then to that data? Is there an archive that you put it on your website?
Sure. Well, one, thank you so much. And two, as far as the analysis of the data itself, I mean, I try to organize things in a way that is helpful to people. So, for instance, on the Singular Freudian Society website, I placed all of the reports into this timeline. So, at least to me, it seemed like that would be helpful to people to be able to go and see, okay, I can look, at these events in chronological order, because often they're reported out of chronological order. So, somebody might see a report that just popped up very recently, but really it took place years ago. And so to really be able to accurately gauge the frequency of this phenomenon, for instance, I think it's most helpful to look at a timeline. Um, and so that's one way. Another way is at the end of literally every article that I write about anything related to the Lake Michigan Mothman investigation, I have this sort of stock paragraph where I sum up all of the commonalities that I've noted to date. So to add some context, frankly, for people to be able to look at, because I don't want people to sort of get one hyper focused on any particular case, but also like I think as we've noted, it's important to pay attention to these trends because it's these trends that have allowed me to begin to develop profiles. Like if I hadn't been paying attention to when certain sightings take place and the common elements in those sightings, I may have never been inspired to even do any research on migratory bird patterns in the area of the Midwest or how they've been affected and how that might play into the sighting. So I think it's really important to be reminded of these patterns as they exist in this data.
Right. And do you think that the appearance of patterns is something that is revealing to any extent about the nature of the data?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, well, like I really just said, I mean, the patterns I think tend to reinforce the validity of specific data. So if you see something popping up in a report time and time again, I think that's something that you need to pay special attention to. Like there very likely could be something to that. Doesn't necessarily mean there has to be something to it, but it's definitely not something you want to ignore.
Well, considering that you have so much of this data accumulated, what do you see as sort of the next steps in this very broad, ongoing investigation?
I think that the next step really is further collation. Frankly, I think that I am far from having examined each of these cases and the specific data for each and having organized it all in a way to gain complete understanding. And so I think that that's probably where we're at is going over the cases again and looking for further patterns, because one of the one of the things I've noticed is far too often in this field, people just kind of put these cases on a shelf and forget about them,
Mm.
and they move on even within their own investigation. So people will forget what was being reported in 2017 because we're in 2020 now and we've got new cases to look at.
Mm.
And I think that's the exact wrong way to go about it. I think we have to continue to look at this as a whole rather than forget the lessons that are still, they're waiting for us from a few years ago that maybe we haven't learned yet.
Mm. In that sort of statement about the mistakes that one can make in this field, which obviously there are plenty of, what would be your advice to people who are looking to get into the analysis of this phenomena?
Sure. I would say, I guess sort of broad strokes as far as like my advice. I think that first and foremost, it's really important to have a passion for this kind of work, because there's no shortcut
Mm.
and it can be very tedious. And if you don't love what you're doing, I think the temptation is to make shortcuts. You can't get into this, frankly, for money or celebrity or anything else. You have to really be passionate about this subject because if you're going to do it right, that's the only thing that's going to subsist you like throughout what it takes to actually uh, 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 participate in an investigation in any meaningful way. Beyond that, um, you know, I would caution people against becoming cynical. That's something that I've seen unfortunately
Mm.
too often. You want to take it seriously, but not so seriously that it ruins your life. Because frankly, answers are something we're very short of, and so you have to be able to have a sense of humor in certain aspects.
Mm.
Treat witnesses with respect. They're human beings. My personal philosophy is that I operate under the assumption that everything a witness is telling me in their testimony is true, unless I have direct evidence to the contrary.
Mm.
And certainly that's happened before. And but that's what it takes for me because I believe that human beings deserve that respect.
Mm.
That doesn't mean buying into somebody's story immediately and with total like credulity. Of course, that's not what it means. It just means that when I'm interviewing somebody, for instance, I'm not just instantly telling them they're a liar or anything. Anytime they say something that sounds fantastic, I'm going to listen with patience and kindness because that's what they deserve. And then I will fact check everything once the conversation is over. And even if I find something that is inconsistent with their testimony, there's no room for personal attacks. Again, people deserve more respect than that. Um, the best thing you can do is present the facts as you understand them and without applying your own specific narrative or bias, understanding that people in general are intelligent enough that if you are pointing out factual inconsistencies in a story, they're likely to come down on the right side of it. And if it's not true, they'll see that.
Mm. Certainly, there are plenty of cynical people in the field, and again, not just cryptozoology, which is where I mostly
Sure.
operate, but in the wider Fortean studies, you could say. And a lot of them, unfortunately, do fall into that kind of personal discourse you're talking about. What do you think is something that cynical people should keep in mind to help themselves be less cynical about the state of this field?
Um, First and foremost, it's don't make it about yourself. It's not about you.
Mm.
It's about the phenomena. Um, so you have to kind of take yourself out of it. Um, I think that's the most important thing, because I think where a lot of that cynicism comes from is a place of ego, where people are, they're either looking to advance their own career and not finding success, or they're looking to prove something to themselves and they're not able to do that in a way that is to their satisfaction. And I think either one of those are just traps, frankly. So yeah, first and foremost, I think people really just have to remember it's about the phenomena, and put that first.
Very wise words, I would say. I think I'm about just out of questions for you. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
I mean, not anything other than thank you so much. Like, this was a lot of fun, man.
It was a lot of fun. This is a really great podcast. I think that people who are watching this as it gets uploaded, and me alike, could say that we could hear you talk for hours about this and not get bored.
Wow, thank you so much. Like, that's very humbling. Like, it's just really nice to hear.
Well, it's a testament, I think, not only to the approach that you have, but also to the thing that I think we can both agree on, which is the significance of this, or at least the potential significance of this phenomenon.
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that has always struck me, specifically about the Lake Michigan Mothman, is just the number of reports and the number of people that have come forward, to speak about it. And I think that, anybody who's sort of looking at it honestly, I think there's a lot there to be interested in.
Yeah, very well said. All right, well, thank you so much for being on today, Tobias. It was an absolute pleasure.
Hey, thanks, Carrick. I'm happy to be here anytime.
All right, fantastic.